In part 2 of our slope unit, we are continuing our discovery of the multiple representations of slope. We have our rule, which is y equals mx plus b. We have a slope formula that we can specifically find slope between 2 points, our graph, and finding slope through a table. So today we are going to focus on just the formula and how we are to find the slope of a line with the following 2 points. And so there is a formula, and I've created 6 tips to help you be very successful with this strategy. Now, our first step is to write down the formula. Our formula is m, which we know that represents slope. So we see that the m represents slope, and that the formula is y sub 2 minus y sub 1 divided by x sub 2 minus x sub 1. Now we will ask ourselves, well, you haven't heard possibly sub 2 or sub 1. That just means the different points that we're pulling that information from. And so after we write down the formula, we're going to replace the variables with the parentheses. So we're not going to start doing our math quite yet. We're going to keep our equal signs in line. And then we're just going to replace each of the variables by the parentheses. Now, step 3 is to label our points. Now we go and look at our points because the question says, find the slope of a line with the following points, -4, 7, and -6, -4. Now we know that this is the x value, this is the y value. Here's the x value, and here's the y value. Now the x sub 1 and the x sub 2 is just the simple point of the sub 1's are my first point, and the sub 2's represent my second point. So before we even start any math, it is very important that we set up the problem correctly. So now all we need to do in step 4 is to plug the points into the formula. So here I see that y sub 2 and y sub 2. So we notice that y sub 2 is -4, and y sub 1 is +7. So we have, here is our -4, and here is our +7. Now underneath that, we have x sub 2, and x sub 2 represents a -6, and x sub 1 is a -4. Now there's a particular strategy of why I asked you to replace the variables with parentheses first. And it's just the point of never really messing up on the negative signs and leaving a negative sign out. Sometimes students, when it gets to this point, they might just say this is the negative and then just put a 4 there, when in essence, there is 2 separate negatives. So here we go with solving problem number 5, or step number 5, is for us to solve for the numerator and the denominator. So -4 minus 7 is a -11, and -6, so we have a negative and a negative, turns those two into a positive, so I have a -6 plus 4 gives me a -2. Now, step 6 is very simple, is that we need to simplify the fraction to find the actual slope. So here we notice that 11 is a prime number and it isn't divisible by 2, so we're going to keep 11 over 2. And then we look at our signs because we can't forget those signs. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. So in this particular example, our slope has the answer of a positive 11 over 2. Now let's go ahead and get some practice with, we have 8 examples here, And I'm going to keep our math tips here for you so you can refer back to and see how we do solve these problems. First of all, let's write the formula down. M equals y sub 2 minus y sub 1, all divided by x sub 2 minus x sub 1. Now replacing, we need to replace those numbers, or I should say those variables. Let's go ahead and erase this right here. There you go. We're going to go ahead and replace those variables with parentheses. Here's for my y sub 2 minus my y sub 1 all over my x sub 2 minus my x sub 1. So here we go. Let's go ahead and label. Remember, we said this is our first point. So it's going to be x sub 1 and y sub 1. And we have x sub 2 for our second point and y sub 2. Now, we would still get the same answer if we switched the points and called this right here x sub 1 and y sub 1, and this x sub 2 and y sub 2. And that's the beauty of this example. So here we go. Y sub 2 is negative 9, and y sub 1 is a negative 18. X sub 2 is a negative 4, and x sub 1 is 1, a positive 1. So if I go ahead and scroll down just a little bit, here we go. Negative 9, now this is going to be a plus because a negative and a negative gives me a positive. So we're going to have 18 minus 9 gives me 9. And then I have 4 negatives minus 1, so there's negative 4, and a negative 1, that gives us a negative 5. So just to clean up our slope, let's have that negative symbol because this is a positive symbol at the top, positive 9 and a negative 5. Let's go ahead, a positive and a negative is a negative, so we're going to have this fraction share that negative, and we'll have a negative 9 over 5. That is pretty darn easy when I look at these math tips and I follow each of these 6 steps. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is to pause the video so you can work on problems number 2, 3, and 4. And then when you're finished, let's check our answers when we return. Welcome back. Now let's go ahead and solve. You've had a chance to work on these 3 problems. Let's go ahead and do what we need to do. Let's go ahead and write that formula down. And you're going to get practice a lot in this lesson of writing the formula down, making sure we label correctly what is x sub 1 and x sub 2 and y sub 1 and y sub 2. So next we have our parentheses. Hope you guys wrote the parentheses down. Let me go ahead and get my red pen and see negative 11 is y sub 2 and y sub 1 is a negative 12. And in my denominator, I have a negative 5 and a positive 17. So here we go. Let's go ahead and what step are we on? We wrote the formula down. We replaced the variable with parentheses. We labeled our 2 points. We plugged the points into the formula. All of these first 4 steps is no math involved. We need to make sure that we understand the routine, so there's no math involved, and it's not until we get down to step 5 and step 6 is where we are going to be adding or subtracting integers and simplifying our fraction. With that being said, let's go ahead and negative 11, and this turns into a positive negative, and a negative is a positive 12. So I have 12 minus 11 gives me 1. And then I have a negative 5 and a negative 17. That comes 5 and 17. It's a negative 22. Now this is a positive 1, and as we did in the previous problem, let's go ahead and simplify the positive, and the negative is the negative, so we can have this fraction share both of the numerator and the negative symbol, and we have a negative 22 is your answer. Did you guys get that? Did you get that as your answer? I hope you did. Let's go ahead and problem number 3. Write out the formula, y sub 2. You're going to say this in your sleep. Let me go ahead and you're going to say this in your sleep. You're going to know this because on the test, accidentally erase that. On the test, you're not necessarily going to be given this formula, so it's very important that you know the formula. Let's go immediately and replace the variables with parentheses, keeping that subtraction sign, because if there was a negative number, we're not going to leave a negative sign out. So here we go. Almost forgot step 3 of labeling your 2 points. Oops, that's going to be a 1. X sub 2, y sub 2. So here we go. Y sub 2 is going to be a negative 4 right there. Y sub 1 is going to be a positive 7. Now x sub 2 is going to be a negative 6. And x sub 1 is going to be a negative 4. So when we're finalizing that, we have a negative 4 and a negative 7 gives us a negative 11. And it's okay to use a calculator to make sure you got your integers correct when you're adding and subtracting your integers. It's okay to use a calculator, and if you could do it in your head accurately, go for that as well. And so we see a negative, 2 negative signs together makes a positive, and so I have a negative 6 plus 4 gives me a negative 2. Negative and a negative is a positive. This problem looks familiar. Does anybody know where we've seen this problem before? Yeah, you're right. It was in our first example right up here that we saw this problem. Now let's go ahead and solve problem number 4. We have x sub 1, y sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 2. I went ahead and jumped to kind of mix the steps around. That's okay. If that's easier for you to understand the procedure, then that is perfectly okay. Once you learn this formula and can be able to say this formula, forwards and backwards in your sleep, then you can go ahead and leave it out and just replace it with these parentheses. So here we go. We have y sub 2 is 8. We have y sub 1 is 4. We have x sub 2 is 5. And then we have x sub 1 is 16. So when we go to solve for the numerator, we have 8 minus 4, which is a positive 4. 5 minus 16 gives me a negative 11. Now to clean this up, positive and a negative is a negative, and we have 4 over 11. Awesome job. I bet you guys are becoming pros at this. So what we're going to do, we're going to continue to do practice. We might leave a couple of the steps out this next time go around, but go ahead and pause the video and then complete these 4 problems, and we'll be right back. All right, we are back, and thank you guys for working so hard on these problems. I'm going to go ahead and let's finish 5, 6, 7, and 8 super strong. Here we go. X sub 1, y sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 2. We probably memorized the formula by now, so let's go ahead and just leave out the formula because we know y sub 2 comes first. So we're going to replace our parentheses. And it's okay if you need to put that formula in there. That is perfectly okay. Or you can reference in your notes a little bit ahead of when we did what the formula was. So here we go. In our numerator, y sub 2 is a negative 9. Y sub 1 is a negative 18. Now we have x sub 2 is a negative 4. And x sub 1 is 1. So here, keeping our equal sign, and that's one thing that I did not necessarily say in my example, but it's super important when we're doing a lot of steps in an equation. You kind of want to have some organization, and that's why I've given you those 6 steps, so you have that organization, but also keeping your equal signs in line helps your brain see the sequential nature, how it goes from step to step to step. All right, so I see that there is 2 negatives that turns into positive. So 18 minus 9 is 9, or I should say a positive 9. Let me go ahead and undo that. So we have a positive 9 over, now I have a negative 4 minus a negative 1, which gives me a negative 5. Once again, we have a similar problem that helps us, and it's always good to have some practice. And if the problems are the same, that's okay, because we are practicing that routine, and we would like to have some problems that are familiar to us, that we've seen before, so we can kind of anticipate the answer, and that builds up our confidence and makes math simple. And so while we're doing this, there is a lot of videos on Math is Simple, so make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and you will get help constantly, and hit those bell notifications so you know when I upload new videos. So we have x sub 1, y sub 1. First, second point is x sub 2, y sub 2. So here we go, let's go ahead and replace the parentheses. So our first point that we do, y sub 2. So let's go ahead and use y sub 2 as a positive 7, and y sub 1 is a negative 7. Or I should say 7. So 7 minus 7. Our next one, x sub 2 is 20, and x sub 1 is 15. So let's simplify our numerator. 7 minus 7 is 0. And therefore 20 minus 15 is 5. And 0 divided by 5 is just 0. So here we can show that we have a 0 slope. And that's okay. In yesterday's lesson, we learned about having a 0 slope. And it's when the letter m, or the variable n, is equal to 0. All right, next we have problem number 7. Hang in there, guys. You guys are working hard. Make sure that you are, I always, even as many years I've done math, I always still like to label the tops of my points so I don't get them confused. So I'd encourage you to do the same. So let's get our parentheses where they are at. The numerator, we're going to start with a negative 12. Y sub 1 is 0. And x sub 2 is a negative 14. And x sub 1 is 7. So simplify. Negative 12 minus 0 is that, a negative 12. And then I have a negative 14 minus 7. If I used my calculator, it would show me that it says a negative 21. Now I still need to simplify. That's step number 6, my fraction for my slope. I see negative divided by a negative gives me a positive answer. And 12 I could divide that by 3. So 3 goes into 12 and 3 goes into 21. So 3 goes into 12 4 times, and 3 goes into 21 7 times. So I can go ahead and divide by 3 to simplify my answer as well. And so my slope is a positive 4/7. Next and last, so we're doing this just out of automaticity, just automatically. We're knowing exactly what to do. This is how you prepare for tests as well. It's kind of doing the same problems a couple times so you remember the procedures and the steps. And I guarantee you guys, by thinking of these 6 steps, when it comes to the test, you are going to be rock stars. So make sure that you are just practicing to help build that math confidence. So here we go with the numerator. It's going to be a positive 10 for y sub 2, and then y sub 1 is a negative 2. And x sub 2 shows me to be a negative 11, and then x sub 1 is 19, or a positive 19. So 10, right here, negative and a negative is a positive. So 10 plus 2 is equal to 12, or a positive 12, over, we have a negative 11 and minus 19. So it's a negative 11 and a negative 19, which is a negative 30. So here we go to simplify our signs. A positive and a negative is a negative. And it looks like these are both even numbers, so they could be divisible by 2, but could they be divisible by something else? And it looks like they could be divisible by 6. 6 goes into 12, and 6 goes into 30. So 12 divided by 6 is 2, and 30 divided by 6 is 5. So our slope here is a negative 2/5. Now, remember in yesterday's lesson, in part 1, we talked about looking at what this slope is in front, and we can correlate it to what the graph is going to look like and what direction that the graph is going to look like. So I could go back here and see that since this slope is a positive slope, I can know it's going to be a positive slope, and it's going to be moving in an upward direction. So let's go ahead and look at all of our answers. This is a negative 9/5, so this is going to be a negative slope. And you're going to see that the line going from left to right on your graph is going to be going in a downward direction. Same thing here. It is going to be a negative slope because we have a negative fraction, and the line on our graph is going to go in a downward direction. Here we looked at, we had both numbers being negative, but negative and a negative is a positive. So we're going to end up with a positive slope, and it's going to be going in an upward direction. Looks like we have another negative slope, and we're going to be going in a downward direction. Down here at the bottom, we will have another negative slope, and it's going to go in a downward direction. So the reason why I'm having you do this is so you now tie part 1 slope unit lesson with part 2 and mesh them together, because it's all going to blend together once we get all 4 parts of this unit together. Now the 0 slope shows that the line is going to be completely horizontal. Okay, and it's going to be going from left to right horizontally. Now in problem number 7, this is a positive slope, so it's going to go in an upward direction. And last but not least, we have a negative slope because we have a negative 2/5, and that line on the graph is going to go in a downward direction. So in part 2, we are discovering the multiple representations, and today we focused on the slope formula, and where we were able to find 2 points that were placed on a graph. We know that we can find the difference of those 2 points by the formula of y sub 2 minus y sub 1 divided by x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And once we plug in the points correctly into the formula, we are going to find the slope. I provided 6 steps for some math tips to help you out. And so I just want to say, hey, thank you so much for working really hard. You guys did an amazing job. And tomorrow we are going to work with our slope unit part 3, where we're going to delve into graphing. So thank you once again, and we will see you next time.